Right, do you remember telling me the story of how when you were working in Canberra, a guy from the CIA picked you up one evening, took you to a pub and said, "This is Boris from the Russian embassy," and uh, and that was all he said, and then he just walked away. Um, and and I was like, "So, what? Some kind of loyalty test? They were like monitoring your conversation with this guy? What was the deal there?" And you were like, "Ah, it's straightforward. There's procedures for it. You submit a form the next day, and it's nothing to worry about." Um, that was, you know, I think that was one of the times where I started to realize that you weren't quite the same as everyone else's dad. Um, and I remember there was like a woman at the school I went to, one of the many schools I went to, and she mentioned to you that her husband worked for Foreign Affairs, and you're like, "Oh, where's he been?" And you're like, "Oh, that particular pattern of assignments must be an ASIS agent, Australian Secret Intelligence Service, for people who are not particularly tuned into all that sort of stuff." Um, and I remember you told me you spent like a couple of hours one weekend telling me what the bases at Pine Gap and Narunga were for. Um, and I thought, wow, this is really important, and most people won't know this stuff. And I went to school and I tried to tell people, and I came home and I complained that nobody was listening. Um, And so the next explanation I got from you was about security clearances and about certain information being top secret and why things are kept secret. It turns out that if people know how you're getting the information, then it helps them lie to you. And a lot of the value of that information, particularly at a time when global nuclear war was a very big concern, it was really, really useful to have accurate information um, about information relating to the risks of global nuclear war. And so I should never explain the bases at Pine Gap and Narunga ever again. Um, and fortunately for me, in the process of making this video, it's been some time since Edward Snowden came out and told everybody, and he told journalists who were interested, as opposed to apathetic high school kids who didn't understand why I was going on about this bullshit. Uh, and uh, and I remember when Mum was dying, and she was getting, and people came to visit because she was very considerate about it, and she spent some time dying. Um, and uh, and you said that there would be certain people visiting the house who would be coming in through the back entrance, and that I was not to ask anything about those people, basically, and especially not their names. I wasn't allowed to take pictures of them, and uh, and I remember one of those guys worked at the Pentagon. Um, he was an American. And this was 2001, so it was not long after the biggest terrorism crisis in United States history. Um, People talk about how two planes smashed into the World Trade Center. There was also a plane that smashed into the Pentagon on that day, and another one that crashed in a field. Um, and And there's a story about how the Air Force sent a fighter to intercept that plane, but it crashed before they got there. And the assumption is that the passengers on the plane had taken action. That's a lovely story, isn't it? Um, and it's certainly much better much more palatable than the notion that it was shot down by the U.S. Air Force. Um, and and a lovely story like that where the reality is just a bit less palatable. Um, I I'm not sure if I believe that story, but I have no evidence. I don't know anything. I do believe the stories that the man from the Pentagon told, or the one story in two parts, because there was a plane that crashed into the Pentagon, and he worked in the Pentagon, so he was very much aware that plane crashed into the Pentagon, as was everyone else that worked there. And one of the jobs of everyone in the Pentagon was to work out what had happened. And one of the things that they did was they analyzed the crash of the plane that smacked into it. Um, and so the very front of the plane hit two officers. There were two officers that were front and center for the impact of that plane. And someone's office has got to get hit first. Um, and the amusing weird thing is that none of the people working in those two particular offices were empty. Other people got killed, but like this is the fun story bit, right? So there was a woman who worked in one of those offices, and she happened to be in a meeting on the opposite side of the building, and was therefore survived the impact because she was lucky as far as that was concerned. And the other office with his family, and so he was traveling. He was on the plane that crashed into the Pentagon. Um, And the moral of that story, as we were told by your friend from the Pentagon, is that sometimes life is just weird. Because there's no there was no concept that he was somehow suicidal enough that he would plan or pretend to plan a family holiday, take his family on the plane, and then be somehow part of suiciding that plane into the Pentagon. Um, no one, no one considered that as a thing that might happen. Um, and I don't, sometimes life is just weird. Um, and there's a bunch of things around 9/11, and firefighters running out of a building saying it's coming down, and 2 minutes after that the news broadcast says such and such building has come down, and then 5 minutes later the building actually falls down. And have a thought for journalists being stressed on the on a very complex and stressful day. And you know um, the conspiracy theory stuff around that was just dumb. um, the thermite stuff, I was telling myself in my head just a minute ago, don't talk about the thermite. All right, let's talk about the damn thermite. So so the building fell, and I haven't actually timed it myself, but there's this notion that the building fell too quickly, that you didn't have one floor hitting another and causing stuff. That you had one floor falling, and there was a shock wave or an explosion, and the whole building fell at once. And people have presented the idea that there must have been like tons of explosives strategically placed in that building, um, in order for it to fall in that way. Um, and it and and I remember thinking this sounds a bit weird, and the people who are talking about it are not as crazy as a lot of the other people. Um, and so I looked into it a little bit, and I learned that thermite is made by mixing molten aluminium with iron oxide. Um, and and I was like, so where would you get a large supply of molten aluminium? Could you get that by melting down a 747 using, say, a whole bunch of aircraft fuel? And if you poured that molten aluminium into the elevator shaft, it's an American building, I'll say elevator instead of lift. Pour all of that down an elevator shaft, would there be rusted iron in the elevator shaft? And would the elevator shaft be a structurally strategic concrete structure that went the entire length of the building? Um, those are the questions that the conspiracy theorists haven't answered. Um, and and I and uh, there's this notion in conspiracy theory land that if there is an unanswered question, then it has to be because someone is hiding something. It's never that we don't know things because life is hard to understand. We only ever don't know things because people are lying. And so conspiracy theorists, can you explain why it is that you haven't considered the possibility that aircraft are made out of aluminium and that there's no real shortage of iron oxide in a building with lift shafts, and maybe if the dust contained a mixture of aluminium and iron oxide, it's not necessarily because CIA agents with bombs had spent several weeks filling their building with explosives. Um, yeah. Which is not to say that false flag attacks don't happen. Um, it's just that false flag attacks get a lot more publicity than they deserve, and it's in the interest of spies want to look cool while they're being and they want to seem powerful. A lot of the power that spies have comes from perceptions that they are everywhere and doing everything. So yeah. I guess that's part of why people don't shut these conspiracy theories down quite as hard as they could. I was part of a minor accidental conspiracy regarding masks and the pandemic. Um, I I did some intelligence. Like there was a project happening out of the University of Melbourne. Can ordinary civilians do intelligence analysis? And I turned out to be pretty good at it, frankly. And one of the questions is, what is the rate of piracy going to be in March 2020? Um, attacks on shipping. Um, and I ended up spending a week analyzing that because all sorts of there is a whole video to be done on that. But at the end of it, I was pretty concerned about this coronavirus thing, and I was on Twitter. It was called Twitter in those days. Um, I was on Twitter and I was tweeting with a bunch of doctors because I thought that maybe I'd sell them something someday. I never sold anything to the doctors, unfortunately, but I was building relationships with them. Um, and the guys from the University of Melbourne were like, we're going to stop doing a lot of the activities that we had planned because we need to focus our intelligence gathering efforts on what the hell is going on with this virus. And so I went to medical Twitter And I said, if you had an intelligence capability as far as coronavirus is concerned, what would you want to know? And they said, we want to know what the deal is with protective equipment. We're not going to have enough masks. Um, and so I went and I researched that for a few hours, and I discovered that there was an Australian surfboard manufacturer who was like, I want to be making masks instead. I'm able to make all kinds of things out of plastic. Help me make masks. And a whole bunch of, like, there was this amazing, beautiful to see coordinated effort to coordinate. Like, there's so much going on in terms of Australia's response to the crisis. It was great. So I went to the doctors and I said, people are working on it really hard. You will have masks as soon as possible, because that was, that was what I could do. Um, and I was very concerned about the fact that doctors who I like, for a lot of reasons, were being killed by this virus. There's a thing called viral load, where where the more virus particles you breathe in, the more likely you are to be infected by it. And so if you're leaning over patients who are breathing out coronavirus particles all the time, then you're very likely to get sick. And so, you had this doctor in China who died of coronavirus because he was the doctor treating all of the coronavirus patients. And, and one of my favorite guys on medical Twitter is this ear, nose, and throat doctor, and he's like, and then others, I've talked about intensive care doctors, right? They're sticking tubes down people's throat and forcing air in so that people can breathe. Also forces air out, and and our understanding of these issues was only starting to emerge. All we really knew was that these very professional doctors who we could reasonably assume were taking good precautions, were 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 dying of coronavirus. Um, and so I, and so people are wearing masks and they're concerned. People are trying to get masks, and there's a shortage of masks. And we kind of learned that masks didn't protect you so much as they protected everyone else. And I made sure I publicized that. I was like, if you're thinking of wearing a mask, be aware that it's not going to protect you, it's protecting everyone else. And I didn't talk about so much there is a desperate mask shortage, because I didn't want to contribute to a panic. And I didn't go into some of the other stuff that was going on. I'm actually having a memory failure here. I'm like, sometimes I do that because I'm being evasive. Other times I do that, that little pause is because I didn't know what to say. The reason I didn't know what to say on this particular occasion is because it was 5 years ago, and I simply don't recall all of the facts right now. This stuff is, I plan it a bit in my head, but I wasn't actually, I was not planning this much detail on coronavirus, and I don't have my thought process from then fully in my head, but I do know that I downplayed the effectiveness of masks, like a lot of other people. And then when the mask shortage had been resolved, because members of the Australian Armed Forces went to the mask factory. Like, we only have one mask factory in Australia, and the surfboard guy couldn't make masks. He could do other things, I think, but we still only had one mask factory in Australia. And the armed forces went in with permission from the guy running the factory and just worked the machines 24 hours a day, continuously, and kept them repaired and all of that sort of stuff. So hooray for that. And if you ever have people who need to learn skills in a hurry, then the Australian Armed Forces are really good at that. They learn in a hurry better than anyone else in the world, as far as I can tell. Um, I hope it would if you're an American and you're really offended by that, please comment. I could use I would like some engagement. It would be fantastic. Where was I? Um, yeah, so that is my role in being part of the dishonesty around coronavirus. Later, when there were plenty of masks, I said there's plenty of masks and you should wear one all the time. And I was really very offended by the people um, where I live. I ended up my postcode was, for most of coronavirus in Australia, the most infected postcode in the country. Um, and and I think I got coronavirus before the testing was rolled out. I honestly do. I spent a week just in that chair there, unable to get out of that chair. And if I wasn't married to someone who wanted me to live, I would probably have died from it. Um, I hopefully I would have had the brains to call a hospital if I wasn't being taken care of. But it was bad, and I'm still really angry about some of that, and I have difficulty going outside because I'm scared that I'm going to get angry and yell at someone who doesn't deserve it. Not that I have a history of actually doing that, but I'm. This is why it's all hi dad, right? I had this idea that I was going to do an informative YouTube channel, and I keep getting distracted by my mental illness. Eventually, that'll stop, I hope. Um, yeah. So there is a conspiracy that I'm aware of that is worse than that. Um, that I'm kind of still angry about because it's still sending shockwaves through Australia. Um, and that's about immigration. So in 1988, I think it was, 88, 89, it must, no, it was 88. There was a brutal massacre in Tiananmen Square. Um, you might remember that I said to you, this is going to be a PR disaster for the Communist Party if they open up on those protesters with anything heavier than a water cannon. You gave me this look. I remember you giving me that look. I never liked it when you gave me that look. I meant I'd said something bad and that it was not clear as to whether something horrible was going to happen. You gave me that look after I made that prediction about Tiananmen Square. And they did open up on those protesters with stuff that was a lot heavier than a water cannon. Um, and and Bob Hawke, Prime Minister of Australia, went to a church and he cried on camera. He was good at that. And he said anyone who is fleeing the violence in China is welcome to come here. And it was a couple of years later that you told me about how the immigration department went to him afterwards and said, okay, we can come up with some criteria and only people from Beijing and things like that. And we reckon that we can limit the number of people that you just let into the country to 200,000. I forget the precise number. 50,000, 500,000, maybe even no. I don't know. It was a big number. It was in the thousands. 50,000 might be the number. I'm remembering a story I was told 35 years ago. But we can limit to this many thousand people. So what we'd like to do is to have the refugee quota for this year increased by that many people, and then we can do the stuff. And Bob Hawke said, no, we're not increasing the refugee quota. And the guys from the immigration department said, okay, we are probably going to need to freeze immigration for all the other refugees for a year then, because it's basically the entire refugee quota is that's what you've just promised. And Hawke goes, no, we're not doing that either. And the immigration department is like, well, you're going to tell people that they're not allowed to come after all? And Bob Hawke is like, no, we're not doing that either. And so eventually what they did was come up with a refugee application process that was really, really difficult and slow, and that was processed in Australia. And that way we could let all of these people into the country without granting them refugee status, and that meant that this political promise could be kept. And that is how Australia ended up with this deliberately bureaucratic and hopelessly inefficient refugee processing system, that then became the basis for offshore detention and this concept that Australia was being swamped by huge numbers of refugees. I really should have said that in the opposite sequence. There's this concept that we're being swamped by huge numbers of refugees because a backlog was created on that one particular day. And as a result of this perceived crisis, you then had the Liberal Party doing their refugee crisis bullshit. And so that is the bombshell conspiracy that I'm aware of, that I don't think most Australians are aware of. I have to say, there are people who, like, they go, such and such official was lying, therefore it's all conspiracies everywhere. It's kind of adorable. When you've had I didn't have a front row seat to all of this drama, I guess, but I had the radio commentary, you coming home from work and complaining about stuff. And I completely lost interest in the political news after moving out from your house, because I didn't have someone on the inside telling me what was really going on anymore. Pretty much everything that gets into the newspapers is theatre. The meaning, God, people are going to run with that, aren't they? So the thing that politicians do that is actually meaningful is that they represent the will of the people. And that is actually important and good. And then they get replaced because they don't represent the will of the people well enough. And in Australia, we are blessed with an electoral system that selects the least unpopular candidate. And so we get a whole bunch of politicians who are largely interested in leaving everything alone and taking credit for every good thing that happens as best they can. And I prefer that over the the sensationalist, constant, desperate fighting that we see in the United States and the race to polarize. Um, you know, a system where the most polarizing politician wins leads to a profoundly polarized political environment. I don't really watch Australian politics, firstly, because I don't have the inside track anymore, and secondly, because Australian politics is so boring. Who the hell wants to watch people politely crossing the street when you got the WWE on CNN? Like, you know, give me the professional wrestling if I'm going to be distracted from the ordinary pains of my mundane existence. Um, yeah, yeah. If these people promoting conspiracy theories knew just how boring real conspiracies actually are, I think we'd see a lot less of it. And yes, governments lie. I think that they're I think that they're as honest as we let them be, but we demonstrate a lot of the time that we can't handle the truth. Uh, Certainly been times in my life where I couldn't handle the truth, um, and I have a diagnosis that confirms cannot handle the truth. More on my diagnosis another time. I think that's where we are today. So let's see what happens next.